Hi, in this video I want to talk about a subject of white space, this white space that we're living in, at least based on a perceptual understanding of the space around us, or a black space. But I want to use a white space as an example of understanding the ethereal nature of our reality. I've probably covered this topic, but I want to cover it in a different way based on a perception more than anything of recognizing just how ethereal and how ephemeral things are, something that I didn't necessarily touch upon in the other video that I made about the ethereal nature of and ephemeral nature of time and such, and it's more of a perceptual thing, and that's the distinction I think I want to make in this video. So in this white space I'm talking about is the very fleeting nature and the very temporal nature. Say you have a house, you walk in your house, you have all these boundaries, all these walls, creating a distinct and interesting new setting and environment, a different backdrop, and something changes. So something happens, and the house burns down, and what's left is a heap of ashes and a bunch of debris. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing new or interesting. It's just completely destroyed, and that pretty much is a good way, sort of like dust in the wind. We're all dust in the wind. And it has to do with more of a perception from a sentient being of recognizing exactly where we are and what we're doing. And it's that once all these barriers have been destroyed, obviously we're all within a barrier, we're all within some kind of barrier, and I think that's something that explains explains how we're built from the atomic level, that there's a barrier, that all these atoms are in around us. The finger that I have right here obviously has a boundary around it, holding all these different atoms in my hand, in my finger, from bouncing out, or there's a boundary is the point I want to make. There's a boundary in these, and a distinction from my finger and something else in this reality, made up by something different. It's made up of a different material than the oxygen that's my hands moving around in. So it's the point I want to make is that that once that house is burned down, it's no longer there. So what was once before creating this boundary, this containment, this different containment, which I would say the world, this reality that we're living is obviously that we're living in is as a containment in and of itself, that's creating some kind of it's a container, and that's the point I want to make. Sort of like a house is a container. I'm looking at the wall over here, and I notice that there's nothing more beyond to this area that I'm around, other than there's a wall. I can go out and touch the wall. I can touch it. I can recognize it's there, and I can say there's nothing I can do but say that this wall is created by things in this reality, and I can say that beyond the environment and the concept environment and perception environment around us, there's nothing more than interacting with this environment, touching this environment. We can't do anything. We can't become one with the environment. But in a way you can. If you get a splinter and it's a wooden wall, you can kind of become one. But that's not really the point I'm trying to make. The point is, if I can find the point and find a way to articulate this point, is that there's this boundary, and there's nothing more or beyond anything but the boundary that can or cannot be destroyed. And the boundary that we don't necessarily know if it can be destroyed yet is the boundary of the reality that we're living in. And based off of only the lack of knowledge that we have at this point, I can only say that based off of some very thin understanding of necessarily recognizing where we are, an expanding universe. If there's something outside, if we can push against something outside of it, recognizing that we are in a boundary, and even if there was no outside boundary, there is a boundary which we're pushing against, that we're constantly in contact with, and there's nothing more or less, and everything can be reduced to this white space or this black space, where there's nothing beyond. You can take away the house, you can take away the grass, you can take away everything, and it's just it's emptiness then, and how everything can be reduced to emptiness, and how it has an effect on the perception of something, a sentient being, and how there's nothing beyond this. There's nothing but boundaries that we're dealing with. Small boundaries, larger spaces between these boundaries, And once you eliminate all these boundaries, you're only in a space. You're only moving around. Once there's no house for you to lean against, there's no walls to create boundaries for you. You're just moving around freely, say, in the parking lot. There's no boundaries. You're just moving freely. You're walking until you run into something. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're obviously dealing with boundaries on a daily basis. That's why we walk down a hallway and we don't walk right through the door or right through the wall, because we have to walk through the hallway, then walk through the door first, instead of just walking through the door and walking through the wall to begin with. So there's nothing more to this reality than interacting with boundaries. And I think this has an emotional connotation too when it comes to recognizing that once you recognize these things, it does change your perception considerably, and it does considerably change your perception of the things around you and your emotional attachment to the things around you once you know just how temporary they are, and that all they are is different boundaries that you're interacting with. You're just interacting with boundaries, different things around you. I can touch the wall, and I've interacted with the wall, and that wall can just as easily be destroyed, and I can just be freely wandering around a white space where I'm just walking around and experiencing the free space, or you can say oxygen on planet Earth, where we're walking around in the air and we're just spinning around doing whatever, and there's nothing more to it than a free space, or a free space spinning around in a room. And then there's boundaries that can create other boundaries. You can create a vent, but you can also make the vent large or small, and the room leads to the event, and you have to go based on these boundaries around you. And these boundaries can have an effect on your perception. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's a perception of these boundaries that makes you recognize that there's only boundaries, and it can be emotionally detaching once you realize all the things that you like interacting with are just different boundaries that you recognize. It's a different way of realizing, but the perception is something wholly and entirely different once you realize that there's nothing more beyond this wall. I'm stuck. I'm in a cube, stuck, not doing anything. I have no controls. Imagine being stuck in a white room with nothing beyond it. There's just white walls, and that's really all we're interacting with. There's just different components that we're interacting with on different levels, different sizes, interacting on the level that we are. And I think I'm making this point very poorly, but I'm trying my best to equate this perception that I have of these boundaries around us, and how it can be emotionally debilitating, and how it can have an effect on your perception around you, and how it describes the reality that we're living in. And it has a connotation to do with this nothingness thing and the infinite thing, and recognizing if there is some outside boundary, if it is an expanding universe, if it is still expanding, and if there's something that we can press on the outside, there's something we could push against, to recognize that we are in some kind of boundary, and that there's no outside, ethereal outside beyond this kind of universe, other than being just a continuation of an extension, just more of a universe that we just haven't found, we haven't made a proper connection to yet. That's part of this universe, but we're constantly pushing against different boundaries. I can just as easily be stuck in this room and recognize that my boundaries are containing me within a certain amount of space, and the space is what creates the somethingness, and that's exactly what we're living in, experiencing, and based off all these other different boundaries around us, there's nothing more than the boundaries around us, and it has a perception that all these different experiences, all these different places can be reduced to boundaries that you're experiencing with. That's a good point I want to make. All these experiences you're having is just interacting with boundaries. All these places you go to, everything you do, every experience you have, everything you're doing, it's based on your experience. It's just running into different boundaries, and the emotional attachment you have, and recognizing that there are just boundaries, can create an emotional detachment, a recognition, a perceptual discomfort in recognizing the world, the exact world that you're living in, and how limited and very rigid that the reality that we're living in is, and there's nothing more to it than the same old thing that we're experiencing, and it's just bouncing off a boundary, sort of like the chess pieces inside of the glass container on top of the shaking cube being controlled by cogs that you press the button to cause it. There's a boundary that they're bouncing against. There has to be some kind of boundary. Otherwise, what are you interacting with other than well, obviously we're made out of a boundary too. You can interact with your hand. sort of as easily you could cut off your arm and interact with your hand still, but you're just not having the feeling of that hand. So we're interacting with boundaries. There's nothing more than interacting with all these different pieces around us, these boundaries, other things that stop us from going towards anything else. And that's all we're doing, is bouncing off of things. Our experience can be reduced to that. All the places we go, all the things that we do can be reduced to boundary interaction. I'm a boundary, someone else is a boundary. We run into each other and we hit each other, and that obviously created a boundary, and it prevented us from moving forward and with any reasonable consideration of understanding that analogy. So yes, that's really all we're doing. We're running into boundaries. There's a white space beyond all this. There's nothing more. How everything is temporary. Everything can be reduced to a white space. If you eliminate the house, there's nothing more than the space where the house was before, and the boundaries have been eliminated, and everything can be reduced to some kind of just empty space, some white space that we can describe, at least on an emotional level, that creates this kind of discomfort that we're living in, this constant emptiness that we have, this constant, the white space that I want to describe is sort of like being in a white room and there's nothing more to interact with other than the boundaries that you have before you. And if there's no boundaries, if there are no boundaries around you, then I guess that would be considered some form of nothingness. I'm trying to continuity of thought. I'm trying my best. So there's a white space. Everything can be reduced to some kind of space within some kind of boundary. That's exactly the point I want to make. The white space inside the boundary that we're living in, from at least our current point of view, our current perspective, can't be brought down to any other level than we're in this white space, and you can eliminate all these different boundaries within this boundary, this bigger boundary that's made up of this white space that we have, or black space, or whatever you want to call it, and then you have all these different boundaries, and you can tear down all these ethereal boundaries, all these ephemeral boundaries, and it creates more of this space, and it can be reduced to this space if you, say, eliminate all these other spaces and boundaries that you're running into. So I think that explains it well enough. I hope it's more of it's a concept more that you have to get perceptually. And obviously, we know we're running into different things if we do something, but it's about reducing it and recognizing exactly what we're doing, and how these boundaries obviously are all our interactions, and how everything can be reduced to just space. And it's and I want to include the white space because it has more of an emotional connotation. How everything that you love and care about can be reduced to nothingness, to whiteness, because it's just pieces and different boundaries that are connected into one, creating a coherent, something that's made up of something that we can obviously make a distinction of, and everything can become distinctionless, like every other human being becoming alike. All these different boundaries we can create the distinction that makes life worth living and worth creating the distinctions for, and making those distinctions to begin with. So everything is a white space. It can be reduced to a white space, a space, based off the lack of boundaries that are very ephemeral, very temporary, that can be torn down at least by any understanding of the reality that we're living in. So I think that explains the point good enough. I think I made the point good enough. White space, it's very temporary, very temporary. There's nothing more to it than interacting with boundaries, and those boundaries can be eliminated, and that creates a space in which a greater space, if the space is it creates a bigger space if you eliminate these boundaries around you. So it's based off of an idea that you are interacting with just space, and you're moving through space, and you're just making this movement through this space, and the space can be reduced reduced to this idea of a lack of boundaries, and the idea that makes us have this perception and distinction of boundaries is what makes this life game possible, is making these distinctions and recognizing these distinctions. And once you eliminate these distinctions, once you eliminate or burn down the house, or have the house that you used to live in burned down, then it destroyed something that used to be there, and all that's left there now is an empty and a space, as opposed to something that was constructing it in a certain particular way, and now it's reduced to something that was confining you in a certain way, completely eliminated, and it's completely irrelevant, I think. So, I think I made my point clear enough. I tried my best, and it's more of a perceptual thing and understanding that you're living in a space of something that can't be that can be changed, and it's just a space that can be reduced down to a space that we're living in, sort of like reducing something to a white room, a room with all sorts of things around it being painted over white and all the stuff taken down, and it's reduced to just space around you. You have nothing else in there, and it's just a very basic reduction. It's a reductionist kind of thing. We reduce everything down to a basic level, and that's really what all the things that we're doing is reducing something to a basic level, and it's a reductionist point of view, I guess. And I think that's it. I think I need to stop talking, otherwise I'm just going to keep going on and making the same point less coherently as possible. So I think I made my point good enough, and thank you. And until next time, bye.